Dr. Jazz.
I was so happy to see
Dr.
you had the
Jazz.
new record out. I mean, I actually followed your music. I was also on Fresh Sound, like in the beginning of the century, like 2003, four.
Right.
So I
Yeah.
checked out all of the guys, that were on the label. So, you were there with Frank and
Right.
your own stuff, of course,
Right.
and there was this portal, eMusic, where you could like every month pay a subscription fee and download 12 albums. And I have all of your albums actually in
Oh,
MP3
cool.
format because I bought them,
Yeah,
And
I loved eMusic.
oh, you
I
know it. Okay.
subscribed to that, and I mean, there's still stuff that I go back through my drives like,
Yeah,
oh yeah, I
me too.
downloaded that. It's like 10, 15 years later. I'm like, okay, I'm gonna get
Yeah,
to this now.
yeah, I'm the
But I was a
same.
big fan.
Yeah, I'm doing that now actually, like putting, from an external drive to the phone when I'm biking or something, albums
Yeah,
from 15 years ago that I just downloaded and didn't even listen to. And I'm like, man,
yeah,
really? They did this?
yeah,
But I was so happy to see that you have a new one out, and especially with Tom. I played
yeah.
with Tom so many times, and he's for me one of the most underrated and the best drummers out there. And I wanted to ask you, how did first of all this connection with Tom begin for this record, or how did you approach this one?
Well, he's one of those guys I'd played with a handful of times over the
Oh,
years in
really?
New York in a bunch of different situations, and we played some sessions, and um, he's just one of those guys. Like I knew at some point I really wanted to do some kind of project with him. So this is really a co-op record with
Yeah.
myself and this trump player Taylor Haskins. So when we were sort of going through what is it we wanted to do and accomplish with this record, I was really like, Tom is the cat. Like he's going to be perfect for this. So that's basically how that came around. So I just sounded him like, hey, we're going to rehearse. We played a couple gigs. We played Cornelia Street a few
Oh,
times,
wow.
and then just decided to record. So that's in a nutshell how it came about. But I've been a huge fan of his. I used to try and go see him as much as possible, playing with Malaby or whoever.
Yeah.
Tim Byrne or I'm a huge fan of. I feel like I'm a broken record. I keep talking about these records. It seems seemingly like all the time, but these two Drew Gress records, that Seven Black Butterflies
Butterflies,
band,
yeah,
like
man, yeah,
man, I can't get enough of those records, and Tom just is
yeah,
amazing on those. Just really good.
yeah,
And I like his approach. Like I remember talking to a friend of mine about how he approaches the drums, and she said, well, he doesn't play here, he plays down
yeah,
here. So it's almost like the toms are where the rhythm comes from rather than the cymbal. I mean, obviously the cymbal is important, but he's kind of flipped it a little bit. Like the cymbal sometimes seems like subservient to like his toms in a way. So I really like that approach, and totally makes it work.
yeah,
He's
yeah,
he's just amazing. And I guess the other thing about him that you sound like you're really familiar with him and his playing, but he also has this knack of like reading music and absorbing it really quickly. He's a great reader, and he really
yeah,
can just cut to the core of a piece like really quickly.
yeah,
Um, and you've really got to be on your toes when you're playing with him. Although I don't find it. There's some other cats who they're just so obtuse and so abstract, like all the time. It's really hard for me to sink my teeth into it. But I always find there's like a core with what he's playing. I mean, even if it's in a totally free kind of situation, there's always something to grab onto.
yeah,
I mean, again, there might not be concrete pulse, but there is a pulse. Do you know what I'm saying? It's a hard
yeah.
thing to articulate, but
No, but
I always
exactly, yeah,
yeah, I always find there's something to hang my hat on. Whereas with some other drummers, sort of who play in that same zone, sometimes I find it more difficult to connect with.
yeah. I agree. I mean, pulse, yeah, or groove or something. It's always for me. It's even if he plays like only on a snare, like, or it's like grooving. It's like,
Yeah.
man, it's I don't know how he does it. It's his touch.
Yeah,
Or
he's a
amazing.
he's just one of those magician guys. And I guess the other thing that's interesting about him is like, if you just go back through his background, like how many different
Yeah,
bands and different people from such a wide spectrum he's been associated with for such a long time.
yeah. I mean, he started, with Kenny, Werner, and
Yeah.
Brazzo, and then Fred Hirsch, and all these piano trios,
Yeah.
basically standards.
Yeah.
And then he went into this wild free stuff and shit, and it's
Yeah.
like, this man, he's so good with everything. So really cool to hear the new record like this.
Yeah.
To hear
Yeah.
him on your music. And but
Yeah.
you mentioned Taylor Haskins, and he's also one of those guys that are discovered through that eMusic portal.
Right.
all those MetaView and Wake Up Call albums. And
Yeah. Yeah.
and how did your story with Taylor begin, actually? I mean, I know you're on those records as well, but like, when did you guys hook up?
I mean, we must have met shortly after I moved to New York in '97. So well, actually, no, we met before that because we met through a mutual friend, a piano player. But we really connected musically when we were both in New York, like earlier in our lives, and we just aesthetically found so much common ground that we just ended up working together a lot. I guess the other thing about Taylor is he's one of those musicians who you connect with on this other kind of, you don't really talk about music, but you just sort of connect when you play together. Like I can't think of someone else who I enjoy playing melodies with as much as him, either, playing a harmony part or playing in unison. We just found the core of the music really quickly without really talking a lot about it. I don't know what that's about. Maybe that's about shared influences, or
Maybe, yeah.
we're just into the same things, or have a fairly wide lens in terms of the music that we like and the music that we consume. But he's a huge inspiration to me too. He's one of the most versatile and wide ranging,
Yeah.
guys I've ever been around. I mean, he's into so many different things. He's always opened my eyes to different types of music, always turning me on to like, hey man, you got to check out Aphex Twin. Like I was like, what? Like, what is that? And then hearing it just be like, I mean, he's the first one who turned me on to Radiohead. He's like,
Oh, really?
you don't
Oh,
know
wow.
radio? Yeah. He's like, you don't know Radiohead? Like, what's your problem? Like, this stuff's incredible. And I mean, I went into a deep, like, the canonical OK Computer and Kid A. Like, I just was like, I could not stop listening to those
Yeah,
records.
it's killing.
Yeah, those were revelatory to me. So he's always been one who's kind of pushed my boundaries a little bit, and also, we have this sort of kinship, like playing music together, but also, again, like I was saying, just showing me stuff that I just didn't know existed that was wonderful. And he's off into a whole nother world. He's into this analog synth thing and modular synthesis and stuff which I don't know a lot about, but I find really, really interesting. And I'm really curious to see kind of where that goes, and also what our trajectory is in terms of, because we have been talking about doing something else. So how all that makes its way and works its way, because I'm not necessarily interested in modular synthesis or don't know much about it, but I am interested in electronics and processing, and like I mentioned those I'll mention them again, those Drew Grass records.
Yeah.
David Torn did some amazing like post-production on those, which
Yeah.
I didn't even really notice until I started listening to those things on headphones, and I was like, whoa, there's something else going on here.
The
I don't even know
delays
how to
and everything.
identify it.
And what
Yeah,
you did.
but
Yeah,
in a very tasteful, very
Yeah.
subtle way. Like
Yeah.
to me, it's still acoustic jazz, but with this added textural element that you can't quite put your finger on. So we're both interested in things like that. So who knows what'll come next, but we're really interested in pursuing some of those avenues.
How did you write for the new record? I mean, you wrote again beautiful music, and when I check, you've been extremely prolific since, let's say, 2000 or 1999. Or, you wrote so many compositions and beautiful tunes, like ranging from short vignettes to longer tunes, like ranging to 9 minutes, or your literature connection. I want to dig into this later, but
No,
for the
sure.
new record, like how did you approach the writing? Did you know that it's gonna be Tom, let's say, on drums, or did you just like,
Yeah,
oh, okay,
absolutely. Yeah, I hardly ever do anything without knowing who's involved,
oh, okay, that's
or
super. Yeah.
I try not to. It's rare that I do something where I don't know the cast of characters and what I have at my disposal. Um, it's long enough ago that I have a I don't have a great memory for how did you write that, or do you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, sure. But what's your
I think
process usually? I mean, like you just sit on the piano and start like with a melody fooling around, or like,
I mean it really depends on the music. I travel around with a little, I don't have it near me, but one of those moleskin books with
yeah,
manuscript in it. So I'll scribble down ideas on that, or I'll sing into the phone. I find like sometimes when I'm just doing something like cutting the grass, something comes, something
yeah,
kind of meditative, doing the dishes, right?
yeah,
Where
yeah,
you're occupied with something else, usually physically, that doesn't take a lot of mental power to do. That's when, for whatever reason, that's when stuff comes to me. I mean, I think I remember talking to McNeely about this, and he's like, "The shower, man. I don't know what it is about the damn shower, but I just get so many ideas in the shower." So that's one thing. Another lesson I learned from Jim was to ask yourself, like, what if I? So, just sitting down with, what if I tried to um, move notes in a triad ascending by half steps? What could I get from that? So just
mm,
taking very small pieces of musical material and just playing with them. Again, what if I did this to this
yeah,
rhythm, or what if I tried playing this melody backwards? And sometimes stuff, will come from that. Just just getting back to this specific um, project. I wanted to write some pieces that had structure, but also allowed everyone to just be really free. So,
yeah,
um, and I'm also really into, regardless if you want to talk about moving into a more free improvisational section or something more structured with more concrete recurring harmony. I just try and set up zones for improvisers, including myself. So I just think about, I want to be in a certain area or in a certain vibe and play over that vibe.
yeah,
So, how do I create that environment to play in, that hopefully I enjoy playing in and the others enjoy playing in too. So that was something I think that really came to the fore for the pieces for this record.
yeah. You can sense that. I love that. I think
Cool.
this idea of moving between improvised and composed, I think that creates so much sense because many times just improvised stuff can be quite. I mean, it can be great, but it can be really like
Yeah. I
doesn't
mean,
go anywhere. Or
it takes really special people,
yeah,
to just create a whole set uh, from nothing,
yeah,
um, where the listener isn't like sort of like, and I'm sure you've experienced this too. Like I've been to some, wholly completely improvised, situations where you're sort of like, okay, let's get on to the next thing. There's a
yeah,
lot.
exactly.
Sometimes there's a lot
Yeah,
of like fishing around looking
yeah,
for the next thing. And sometimes, it's like worth the wait. And other times it's like, yeah, that really wasn't worth the wait. And I'm certainly, I know I've been involved in those and been guilty of that, trying to collectively find your way through and create a form that makes sense for the listener. So in a way, sometimes I think if you come to the table with just, even if it's just sketches or
yeah,
a loose form, it can really help to direct things, and try and avoid, some of those lulls, I guess, in the
yeah,
music. That being said, man, there's some people like, again, I mentioned Tony. Like Tony's amazing.
yeah,
I've seen him. I've seen him play with groups who do that with him and without him, and when you add him to the mix, he, he's such a strong, authoritative figure that he's
yeah,
able to, again, like kind of shape the music in a way that didn't seem available to the other members of the ensemble until he arrived. You know, his chemistry really changes the nature of the flow, and again, the idea about creating form out of nothing.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, he's. We had one tour like pre-COVID, and I remember we played a gig. I had like these tunes, but you know, like the sketches, leaving a lot of freedom. And we played an amazing gig in Austria. The first gig of the tour, it was, you know, the impros. Wow, you know, we went into zones, and then the second gig, you know, you know, like we played the head, and I try, you know, I'm learning. I kind of go in the same zone, and he's just not playing. And I'm like, okay. And he's not playing after 2 minutes, you know, like, okay, yeah, obviously not, something is not good. And then I asked him after, so what happened? And he was like, well, you know, we don't do the same stuff. It's just, you know, it's not the same audience. It's not the same vibe. I just wasn't there. And I was like, yeah, oh, fuck, man, I'm sorry. Like, you know,
Yeah.
like, and it made complete sense, you know, and then the music on tour evolved always different because
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's for him. That's one of the things I learned from him and really admire about him is, like his purity, like the purity to, he's so dedicated to spontaneity and just
Yeah.
pure improvisation. And yeah, if you did that the night before, he's going to do everything but that, you know, which I admire. I don't know if I can. I don't know if I can really do that to the same extent, especially because more of my music is more structured.
Yeah.
So I think there's room for both. I think there's room to, you know, inhabit the same bandwidth, but not do it exactly the same, because it's never really going to be exactly the same.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
But he's just looking for like a 180. He wants a complete contrast, you know, which I think is incredible. You know,
Yeah,
I've always really admired that about him. And, you know, that's an aesthetic that I hope to achieve someday.
Yeah, we're aiming there, but it's just, yeah. No, but come on, you know, when I listen to what you've done, you know, your impros are always. I never saw you live, unfortunately, yet. But you know, on the records, it's incredible. They make so much sense what you do, and I wanted to ask you, like, you know, let's say mid '80s or late '80s. What were composition wise, especially the people who got you interested in, or let's say, you know, or improvisation wise, you know, who were the players that blew your mind on the saxophone? You remember?
Well, I mean, in the 80s, like,
Or like,
that was when I was back in high school. I mean,
yeah,
I'm
like when
happy
you
to
were
talk about that.
when you were a teenager, what got
Yeah,
you
so
excited?
when I was a teenager, like it was Michael Brecker like
Oh, really?
24/7. Like,
Oh,
yeah,
wow.
he was like Jesus to me. I'm not a religious person, but that's the closest thing to like religion I ever really experienced. That was all that music, you know, was incredible to me. I still love that shit. I mean, it's just so happening.
His
He
solo
was,
records, like when they started coming out, right? Like,
yeah, I mean, that
yeah,
first Michael Brecker record
yeah,
with Jack and Charlie and Matheny and Kenny
Kenny
Kirkland, like,
Kirkland, yeah,
forget it. I still love that record. I
yeah,
mean, there's so many great things about that record. You know, in terms of writing, I don't know why, but I just got the idea that I wanted to write as well as play. I think it's just was from sort of osmosis of like, you know, you get Train records or Wayne records or Joe Henn records, and it's all their music. So I'm like, oh, I just think oh, this is what you do. You learn to
yeah,
play and you learn to write. And you learn to write so you can set up zones or vibes that you want to play over, you know. But certainly it took me a really long time before I wrote anything that was like remotely playable. I mean, I do remember trying to write like in high school, especially at the beginning of college. And it was just awful, like really, really bad, super derivative, you know. It just didn't have any kind of aesthetic integrity at all. Like, it was just terrible. But I guess for me, I tell my students like that's really part of the process. Like
Yeah.
you kind of have to write like 50 or 60 just real terrible things before at least that was my experience. Maybe it's different, because I never really studied writing with anyone for a really long time. The first guy I studied writing with was a classical composer, and so he was game to help me, but he certainly wasn't up on jazz theory and chord scales and all of the things that sort of come with the basics of, or at least today, not that you have to do this, but the basics that sort of come with writing in a jazz style, or writing, I don't know what you want to call it. It's so difficult to label things anymore.
Yeah, sure, but I know what you mean.
The boundaries are so wide, but so take that for whatever you will. But yeah, that's really how I occupied a lot of my time, just writing terrible. And sometimes I would I think it was helpful, listening to some music that I really liked.
Yeah.
And then trying to write something off of that, or like, oh, this is. I remember distinctly. I was really into this Joey Calderazzo record called "In the Door."
Yeah.
And there was a tune of his on there, like a kind of a burnout tune. I think it was called Caldo's Revenge or something like that. And I totally did a complete rip off of that. But it was the first one I wrote that was actually. It was pretty terrible because it was so derivative, but it was playable. Do you know what I mean? It was like that was the first one I sort of remember. Like, I could play it in a session and be like, it's pretty derivative, but yeah, it's playable. It's a little 3/4 kind of burnout, kind of modal thing. So that's looking back at that time in my life. Same thing with Brecker. Like, a lot of it was just trying to figure out what he was doing, and going for that sound and playing metal mouthpieces and all that whole scene with the saxophone too. It was pretty derivative. But again, I think that's a good way, to learn. So yeah, the writing thing for me, it was really just, and it's still that to this day. Like I will sit down and try a lot of things that are very unsuccessful.
Yeah, sure.
So they just go into the garbage, and I try again. I think that the ratio is a little better than it used to be because I have a little more experience now, and I have an idea of what will and will not work. But I'm still trying things. I'm still going for different things in my writing.
I think we evolve. Let's hope we do, right? If you check like whoever of the big ones, it's their writing has always changed, went into like complete different directions, which is, I guess that's what we should do. If you could just keep on writing 2/5/1 tunes, then it's like, okay,
Right.
it doesn't make sense. At least to me, it doesn't. I would get so bored to play that stuff. What about this melodic character of your tunes? Or like, I always sense this strong emphasis on melody. And where does this come from in your sense, if you look back on your evolution?
Yeah, I guess, the two people who come to mind, there's many people who come to mind in terms of melody. But Wayne Shorter and probably Kenny Wheeler, just such evocative, beautiful, haunting melodies. That was always really attractive to me. In some regards, I've tried to. I have a new project that's a little more based in rhythm than it's based in melody. There's still melody, but it's much more rhythmic oriented than it is melody. And that was for actually that reason that you just alluded to earlier. If you kept trying to do the same thing, you'd get a little bored. So I guess in a way I was getting a little bored. Or I was just thinking, like, what's something I can do so I'm not writing kind of the same thing over and over again. So I just decided to explore the ideas of like different rhythms and meters all existing like at the same time. So yeah, so I'm looking forward to that coming out at some point. It was a really great process to investigate, you know.
You already recorded it or like wrote tunes?
Yeah,
Or
it's been recorded and it has to be edited and mixed. So I'm trying to
who
find a
who is
time
it?
to.
Who is it with?
So it's with a lot of my colleagues here at the university, John Hebert,
Oh, really? With John? Oh, wow, man, super.
yeah, this drummer named Keith Hall,
Oh, okay.
this pianist named Matthew Freese.
Oh,
He all everyone they were all New York people, and they've all come out to Michigan
fantastic.
to teach. Um, so yeah, it's
Oh,
a fun
beautiful. Looking for.
yeah, it was a fun project. There's some, there's some processing and the tunes are there's a lot of extended tunes with different sections. Yeah, just it's just a real investigation of this idea of like recurring patterns of in different rhythms and
Yeah.
meters, and so you can sort of focus on your ear kind of goes to one thing and then you're sort of pulled out of the pulse by something else and then you're pulled back in by something else. That was kind of the idea anyways.
Oh, super. So sounds
Yeah,
cool. Yeah.
yeah,
But Andrew, I just wanted to go back a little bit when you
sure,
mentioned Kenny,
yeah,
and he's for me like top three composers ever, and
yeah,
I transcribed so many of his tunes and solos, like going back to I don't know 1968, the windmill stuff,
sure,
and everything that he did,
yeah,
and he played on sculptures and of
yeah.
yours, and like how did your story and your connection begin with him? I think I sensed you did also the memorial concert, like you were quite a strong figure there. And how did this connection with Kenny begin, actually?
So I first met Ken at the Banff Center of the Arts, which
Ah,
is there's a
okay.
jazz workshop there. Dave Holland used to do it,
Okay.
used to run it, and then this really great Canadian composer and trombone player and pianist Hugh Fraser. That when I went, he was running it. So Ken was there, and that's why I went. I went just to like this is my opportunity to be around this guy.
Yeah.
Um, so I went twice. The second time I went, um, I took I was ready. I took a bunch of music, like, okay, I'm gonna play this music with this guy. So we did like a sextet project um, with Ken and with this great tenor player Pat LaBarbera who
Yeah.
um,
Oh, really?
lives in
Oh, wow.
Toronto.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, and we just kept in touch. I did a record with him with a bunch of Canadian musicians a couple of years later. That sort of kept us in touch. And then I just thought it was silly that someone of his stature hadn't really worked that much in New York.
Yeah. Bizarre.
So so I approached the people at Birdland and said, "Hey, this is crazy." And they're like, "Yeah, it is crazy. We should do something." So I said, "Hey, you want to do something?" And he's like, "Yeah, if you put it together, I'll do it, you know." So I put a big band together, and the first time we did 2 weeks there. The first time we did the Sweet Time Suite, and then the second time we did it, maybe 2 years after that. I was much younger, stupider, and much more audacious, and I said, "Hey, can I write something for this?" And he said, "Yeah, absolutely." So I wrote like a little, three movement suite that set some of the poetry of Margaret Atwood to music, and he soloed on it. He seemed to like it. Um, you know, I said you veto this if you don't want to do it at the rehearsal. He seemed game, so we just sort of did. It was mostly his music, and then this little suite that I wrote that was maybe like 25 minutes long, 20 minutes
Mm.
long. And man, to hear him play solos in a jazz orchestra setting like that when you wrote the music, I
Yeah.
mean, it was like the hair was standing up on my arms. It was really amazing. Um, and then I pitched Jordy, "Hey, I want to get Ken on a record," and he was game, and so he flew to New York and we did a couple gigs, and then we did this record in one day at Masuyo's studio on Green Street. Um, And that's still one of my favorite records, just because he's on it, and just to have that sound and his vibe, and again, someone else like to play a melody with him. Oh
Yeah,
my God. I mean, just, to get to try and blend with that sound, which is so unmistakable and just so burnished and huge and beautiful and rich and dark. And,
yeah,
that was like a dream come true for me.
yeah. Did you play like gigs also with that band, or like tour?
Yeah, we played a couple gigs in New York,
Okay.
and we did a
Oh
little
wow.
we did a little tour in the Northeast. We played like at the Regatta Bar in Boston
Oh
and in
really? Oh
Portland,
wow.
Maine. And
Oh
yeah, yeah. So it was fun to do that. We all had a great time, and everyone just really dug hanging out with Ken. And
yeah.
he had this really very dry um, sense of humor that was pretty funny. It's great to be around him and hang
Yeah,
out with.
he's still so, I think, so underrated.
Yeah,
I mean,
agreed.
we know him, musicians know him,
Yeah.
of course, like, but you go wider and it's like, yeah, you know, it's, you listen to some of the records he did and he should be like really up there,
I
I
mean,
think,
you listen to New High. I mean,
Yeah,
that's a masterpiece. Like, I I don't care
yeah,
who you are or what records you want to talk about. Like, that's right up there for me with anything else you want to name.
yeah,
I mean, it's a masterpiece record. It's brilliant.
yeah, yeah, true. I mean, yeah, all the compositions he wrote, and I listened the other day to Angel Song,
Oh, I mean,
and it's
it's
just like
incredible.
I have goosebumps. It's just like you put
Yeah,
that on, and it's just like, really,
yeah.
how do
That's
you
a
do that?
brilliant. Yeah, that's a brilliant record, and a really interesting record.
Yeah,
I asked him about that, like, why no drums? And that was Manfred's idea,
really.
to not have drums. Yeah.
Oh,
And I think it was also Manfred's idea to get Lee on that record. Um, there's another, I don't know if you know this. Now, I'm not at home. I would go and look it up, but they did another record on like an Italian label, Lee and Ken.
really,
Yeah, and they play some of the Lee melodies like Subconsciously, and
really. Oh
you
wow,
know
I
what I
have to
mean?
check it out.
Yeah, it's really cool. It's more straight
Wow.
ahead, and it I don't know if you got to know Ken, but he always was
No,
kind
I've
of
never met him.
he
No.
always kind of like he always kind of denigrated his like straight ahead playing.
Yeah,
I don't know how to play bebop, and I was always like, who cares? Like, just play, like, just that sound alone. It's just
yeah,
that's all you
exactly.
need. So it's interesting to hear him in that context, which is obviously much more of Lee's wheelhouse, playing that way. It's a really cool record. When I get home, I'll
Please
take
let me know, or I'll
I'll send it
Google.
to you.
Yeah, I'll
Yeah,
check it out. Yeah,
yeah, it's
yeah,
really cool.
yeah. He's like one of those guys. What you said now, this being humble and also so egoless in playing. When you listen to the records, it's just like
Yeah,
serving
Ken
the
was
music.
Ken was almost. I mean, he was egoless to a fault. I mean, that you might say that's one of the reasons why he's not as famous as
Yeah,
he really should be, because he just wasn't interested in, you know, really talking about himself. I mean, just to come back to when I was at Banff with him, the second time it was after Music for Large and Small Ensembles had come out, and when I heard that, I really was not that interested in big band until that. Like, that was the gateway drug for me, and then I started to like, oh, I really need to go back and listen to the Duke suites and a lot of things that are, all the Gill stuff. And I mean, I'd listened to that stuff, but I hadn't looked at it in a way
yeah. Studiously, or
from
yeah,
from the perspective of learning the music to the point where I wanted to use some of those lessons, as a writer myself.
yeah,
Um, but I just badgered him. I badgered Kenny for lessons. Like, can you give me a right? And he just didn't want to give it up. Like, he just didn't. He was almost like, oh, what am I going to show you? I'm like, well, show me what's on this record. Like,
yeah, exactly.
and so finally, on a Sunday morning, he's okay. Let's get together, and he pulled out a score. Oh, it's just fourths and fifths. That's all it is. It was just hilarious. Like, I'm like, well, there's got to be more to it than that. Can you can you tell me about your process? And
Yeah.
it really was like pulling teeth. He didn't really, and for me, it wasn't that he didn't want to give it up. It was more like he just didn't feel worthy to be telling me, like, why would you ask me? Like, go ask Hugh. It's
Yeah.
just like, well, no, I'm asking you because your music is so important to me. I just found that kind of funny.
That's so bizarre, man. Yeah, but
Yeah.
I can so see that because like I try to ask everyone who played with Kenny or like with John Abercrombie, like two of my heroes, like about these guys because they're like so important to me as well, and I never got the chance at least to play with them. And John I saw
Yeah.
live so many times, but not Kenny, so
Yeah.
it's so important that we keep this alive also, this the stories and the heritage of
Yeah.
these guys.
Sure.
I think that's
Yeah.
so important.
Yeah.
And but Andrew, I wanted to ask you, like going back just like 4 years before that, like how did Jade happen? And it's for a leader debut album, it's quite unusual, very special album. But how did you decide to do it? And like when did you feel you were ready actually for that one?
Yeah. So that's actually my second record. My debut record was this record called Scatter Some Stones, which was
Ah,
just
shit.
a little bit more, I don't want to say traditional, but it was a quintet record. Taylor's on it.
Oh, with Jeff Hirschfield, that one,
With
and
Hirschfield,
George
yeah,
Colligan.
Hebert and George
Oh
Colligan, yeah.
shit, that's
So
the first one.
that
Ah,
was
then I
actually
mixed
my
them up.
first record. But
Okay, I
Jade
have
was
that one. Yeah.
shortly after that. Um, I was coming home on the subway one night, and in New York, they used to have this thing that the New York Public Library, they would actually take advertisements out of the placards that are on the top, the advertisements
Yeah,
called Poetry in Motion.
I remember that. Yeah.
So there was this poem, and I was just sitting, reading this poem by this Hawaiian American poet named Kathy Song,
Yeah.
and it was from that collection called Jade. And I started reading it, and again, I don't know why, or I don't have a reason, but I started hearing a melody as soon as I started reading it. So I got out my little moleskin, thing of manuscript, and started furiously writing the poem down and trying to get this little melody down. And that is the first. That's the melody you hear, on the first track.
Yeah.
I'd never set poetry before. I didn't know I would ever set poetry. It wasn't something that was on my radar. So I set that, and then I just thought, well, this would be interesting if I did a little bit of a larger group, so that's why it's a septet. I thought it would be nice to have some horns. But it's a weird, it's like trumpet, a lot of soprano saxophone, but some tenor, flute and horn, French horn.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I thought I wanted to go for sort of that, more chamberish type orchestration.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's how that came about. So I started with that first piece, and then I found the rest of the collection, and I just said, well, let's see where this takes me. And then again, I pitched it to Jordy, and Jordy was just into different stuff. Like he wanted to, I mean, thank God, right? I mean, he documented so much amazing.
True. He was so important in that era, I think.
Yeah, totally. I mean, he still is important. He's still putting out records.
Yeah.
There's so many, it's kind of hard to keep up with them all.
Yeah.
But just so many of those early records on that label,
Yeah.
I just think they were so important. I mean, I hope in 100 years people discover them, like, wow, there was something really going on in New York at that time. And there's some great records. I mean, I just felt a privilege to be amongst the people who were on the label at that time and getting to document some of my stuff.
Yeah.
So that's how that came about. I was super proud of that record.
How did you continue then your connection with? I mean, I studied literature, so that's why I'm interested. And you did then the Margaret Atwood thing, and like, so you continued your connection with literature was there like, how did that happen? I mean, like,
Well, so the reason so when I put that first record out, my mom was an English teacher, so she actually was like, "Oh,
okay.
did you know Margaret Atwood? Have you ever checked out any of Atwood's poetry?" I was like, "I didn't know she wrote poetry." I mean, I'm Canadian, so she's such a huge figure
Sure.
um, in Canadian, the firmament of Canadian culture, but also literary circles. But I had no idea, and man, she's written a lot of poetry. She was super prolific in that realm. So my mom sent me some poems, and I thought, well, I'll take a crack at setting these, and I gave those a go. Those came out on a record called True Stories. So
Sorry.
that was the
Yeah.
first time I set those, those poems to music. I guess another person I should mention who was really instrumental in pursuing the idea of using poetry in a lyrical context is Frank Carlberg. He's
Yeah.
done a ton of work in this area, and I've always been a huge fan of his music. And I think I learned a lot from his approach. Our approaches are completely different. Our music doesn't sound anything alike. I mean, I love Frank's music. I wish my music sounded more like his music, because he is just one of my favorite writers and piano players. I have every single one of his records. They're all really important to me. But so he was also important in terms of that, in terms of setting poetry to music. I learned a lot from him. So I just kept pursuing that. As I mentioned, I did that one project. I think there's 4 pieces on that record. And then, I gave the story I was telling you about before about the suite I wrote for Kenny. That was also another setting of Atwood's work. That was called the Power Politics Suite. And then I ended up doing this whole jazz orchestra record centered around, these 2 suites
Atwood
of,
suite.
again,
Yeah.
setting
Yeah.
her,
Yeah.
Atwood suite, setting her poetry to music. So, it was, I just enjoy it. It's an interesting exercise in terms of crafting a melody, because now you have this other element you sort of have to deal with. And like we were referencing earlier about, changing your thing up, or, pushing yourself for something new. If you add a lyrical content, you're just going to be forced to do that. You have no choice. You have to serve the text in a way. And some of my work serves the text better than others, but at least something that helped me was, or that I found interesting, was that it did force me to write melody in a different way. So yeah, I've always really enjoyed that. I think I'm going to take a little break from setting stuff to music for a while, setting poetry to music for a while. But I really enjoyed the places that it took me and the lessons that it taught me.
How did you do that? I mean, with Atwood, with Margaret Atwood, let's say, like reading a poem, or like have it in front of you, examining the structure, or like.
Well, the very first one, it was more about the rhythm of the words than it was about anything else. Like Kathy Song's work, it was more about the gait of the songs. Atwood's stuff, I guess for me, I was looking for things that were like lyrics, that I thought this would make a good lyric. There's other instances or examples of people who are framing things that are a lot, that wouldn't really resemble a song lyric. So that leads them to a much different place. So I was looking for things that were somewhat more lyrical in nature in terms of crafting melodies around them. Some of her more obtuse things, there's no way I could have done those things justice, at least at that time. Maybe now I'd stand a better chance. So that's why I was attracted to those works, because they did look like song lyrics to me.
How did I mean, like on those records, like Luciana Souza seems to be so instrumental also. How did you hook up with her?
So we went to New England Conservatory together, and I was in her band for a number of years.
Oh, really?
She's one of my closest personal and musical friends. So I also learned a ton about setting things to music through her, through her own writing and her own lyrical content, or you know, she did that record of Elizabeth Bishop, the songs
Yeah,
of Elizabeth Bishop, which was
beautiful.
really important to me too. Yeah, I mean, it's a masterpiece record too. Um, so I think I learned a lot about that from her, just osmosis by being in her band. And she's always been super supportive of me and my work, and always been a total, you know, willing participant, just kind of game and up for anything. And I was super fortunate to be able to get her, you know, to be on Atwood Suites, to be the singer on the. There's two singers on that record.
Yeah, yeah,
There's
yeah, yeah.
Luciana, and then on the second disc, there's a really incredible soprano named Aubrey Johnson,
Johnson.
who
Yeah,
doesn't sing any lyrics, but she's an instrumental part of the ensemble writing.
yeah. And how did you get Bill Stewart? I think he's on drums on that one, right? With Alan
Yeah,
Howard. Howard actually. Like, did you play with Bill before, or like?
um, hmm. I don't think so. I think that was the first time.
Okay.
Yeah, I've done two things with Bill. I think that was the first thing we did. Um, I just wanted to get his, like, he's just, man, again, we were talking about Tom, Bill, the same thing. Just the vibe is
Yeah.
just so incredible. Um, you know, in I don't care what anyone says. If you're in a big band or involved with a big band, it's not really your band. It's really the drummer's band. So
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
drummer is such an important part of the tapestry of the music.
Yeah.
So, you know, I've just always been a huge fan of his, and I just really wanted to get him involved in some of my projects. So it seemed like a good
Yeah.
opportunity.
Yeah. Definitely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Otherwise, Andrew, I wanted to ask you also this. You know, I've read. I mentioned Abercrombie before. You also played with him or cooperated,
Just
or
just through Ken, just with
oh, okay.
Ken. He did the first week at Birdland that we did together.
How was that like?
It was amazing. He was great. Although I'll tell you I'll tell you a funny story is the, you know, the way the band set up, like Ken and Luciano were sitting, well, they were all sitting three in a row, but John's amps were behind them, and it was one of those periods where he was really interested in playing in stereo. And the first night, it was so loud, like the guitar was so loud, and Ken finally like was like, John, you know, he's like, you gotta turn down. And John was cool. He's like, oh, sorry. And he quickly, like, you know, took the amps from 11 to 8 or whatever that they were at. But um, it was super cool, and I speak about him a lot to students in terms of
Ooh,
comping, because
yeah.
that amazing, like, single line, you know, I'm sure it stems. I'm not sure. I know it stems from Jim Hall, but that idea of just playing like this contrapuntal moving line through a piece, man, I was always super into that, you know. And I asked Ken about that, like, you know, on music for large and small ensembles, like, Ken was like, yeah, John just soloed the whole record. Well, he's not really soloing, but
Yeah.
he's
Yeah.
creating these lines, like, they're not in the foreground, but they're not completely in the background either. They're sort of somewhere in the middle. They're not distracting, but
Yeah.
it's amazing. It's
It's,
amazing the
yeah.
kind of things he comes up with. I've always been a huge fan of his. I have a great number of his records, and he was incredible.
Yeah. 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 I couldn't agree more. Yeah.
Yeah, I wish I'd gotten to do more things with him. We only ever got to do that one thing, and he was super cool. It was amazing.
Was that recorded? That Birdland stuff? Do you have some bootlegs
I
or
mean,
stuff?
I have some recordings of it, but
Like-
nothing.
Send
Yeah,
me.
okay.
Come on. No,
All
come
right.
on. No, no.
Okay.
No,
I'll
I'd love
dig
to
them out of
hear.
the archives and send you some
I would
stuff.
love to hear that. Yeah. But
Yeah, yeah.
just to end, Andrew, like, you know, you mentioned you're mixing the new rhythmical album, and otherwise, what's your writing or for the future
Well,
ideas?
the
Any
next
projects like?
the next project that's going to come out is really interesting. It's a project with John, Hebert, myself, and this drummer that I mentioned before. I play with a lot. Who's a dear friend, Keith Hall.
Mhm.
So we're collaborating with a composer who's also really involved in like live digital processing. So there's there's basically like one or two pieces that we play, but it's mostly playing free. But the idea is that, you know, I play through some electronics, John's playing through some electronics, but this other musician, his name is Christopher Biggs. He takes what we play and processes it and then spits it back at us, so we react to things that we play. And he manipulates them. He manipulates them temporally or sonically. It's mostly temporal changes that he institutes. And it's amazing. It's been really instructive. It's really changed the way I play, I think, a lot, especially in this particular situation. So we did a record last year that's just been, the mixing's just been completed, and we're hoping that it's going to come out in the next few months. So I'm super excited about that. I think it's a really, for me personally, it's the most abstract thing I think I've ever done. But I really like how it's come out. And I really like the other guys in the band and how everyone's reacting to one another, but also how everyone reacts to these textures, because they're otherworldly, right? Like some of the sounds that are coming back at you, they're sounds of like, well, it's you, but you can't identify it as you, you know. It's really interesting. It's been a lot of fun to be involved with that.
That's super to hear you, like in this more open section, you know, context also. I mean, already this one with Tom that we mentioned, it's like, you know, you're dipping your feet into this water, and now this, so it's quite cool to hear you in this context. So beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, I probably, you know, it's, since I left New York, it's been a little different, but when I was in New York, I was definitely gravitating more towards playing that way more of the time than, you know, playing tunes really. So that's a big part of me and a big part of, you know, my playing. It's really informed my playing, even in a traditional context. I like to think that I bring that to the table, and it's really helpful, you know, been helpful in my approach to playing in a more structured setting.
Yeah, definitely. Super. Man, yeah, looking forward to hear this one. Beautiful.
Yeah.
Cool.
Great, man.
Great, Andrew. I'll not take more of your time. So, you know, just we went through some of the cool stuff you've done. So that's beautiful. So.
Well, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, nice that you sent me the, you know, you were on the list of people who I wanted to talk. So
cool.
Sooner or later it would, you know, I'm like usually going through my records. I'm like, man, yeah, sure. Like, I just drop a line to someone like, yeah, I would like to do it. Yeah, sure, let's do it. You know.
But I've really enjoyed your series and checking other people out, and people whose music I really admire, but never really had a chance to get inside their head or what they're thinking about or who they played with or their backgrounds and history. So it's been really great. I really appreciate you doing this for the you know, improvised music community. It's really, we need more folks like you.